Hello, my name is Clara White, and I am an economist and a political scientist. I'm also the executive director of Padea Mundi, a non-profit organization dedicated to building an ethics of thought and action in favor of all human and living beings on this planet. This thanks through the promotion of culture, arts, and humanities. Today, I'm going to make a presentation in the context of the Fifth International Conference on Public Policy in Barcelona 2021 of the International Public Policy Association. My presentation deals with getting back to the roots of nihilism and cynicism in modern democracies. How do we rebuild trust? So first of all, let me give you a hands of the outline of my presentation. I will first talk about the political regime we're living in at the moment, which I consider to be based on duplicity, what leads to cynicism and nihilism. In a second part, I will show how duplicity is the result of a long process of moral degradation. In a third part, I will give you some preliminary ideas on how we could rebuild trust by building a new ecological civilization. So first of all, the political regime in which we're living at the current time. First of all, I would like to get back to the reason why human societies are formed in the first place. Those societies rely on a search for the common good. In fact, human societies, be they cities, nation states, etc., were born out of a search for the common good, for an order in which people can easily fulfill their basic needs, find safety, protection, and justice thanks to common values, law, and institutions. Institutions that can be economic, political, etc. Now, those societies, in order to work properly, need to be organized. And the way in which they're organized is called a political regime. Philosopher Leo Strauss tells us that a political regime is the order, the shape that gives a particular society its specific character. It is at the same time its way of living, its lifestyle, its moral orientation, the form of the state, the form of its government, and the spirit of its laws. Now, these days, we are supposed to be living in liberal democracies. Those are political regimes that search for a balance between collective interests and individual freedoms. A democracy, as its Greek root entails, is a government of the demos, that is, of the people. It grants a share of political power to any citizen beyond a certain age, and this independently of his or her fortune, gender, age, etc. To work properly, liberal democracies rely on a series of preconditions, though, ranging from a strong middle class to a flourishing civil society and a loyal opposition. That is, an opposition that is ready to tolerate different ideas and their electoral victory. Relying on those bases, we may legitimately ask whether we still live under liberal democracies. In fact, today we notice rising inequalities that are threatening the middle class. We also notice the rise of a so-called cancel culture that relies on identity politics and that makes sane debate increasingly difficult. For those reasons, we see that some of the bases on which liberal democracies rely are currently threatened. Now, if we're not in liberal democracies, in what type of political regime are we? I make the hypothesis that we currently live under so-called neoliberal oligarchies, in which we witness unprecedented levels of wealth concentration. According to Plato's Republic, Book 8, an oligarchy is a government resting on a valuation of property in which the rich have power and the poor man is deprived of it. The biggest evil of oligarchies, adds Plato, is sedition, a state of permanent internal war between the richest and the poorest, characterized by a constant effort of the richest minority to create divisions among the poorest majority so as to restrict its ability to overthrow its authority and build a better political regime in favor of the common good. Now, modern oligarchies as modern democracies, which are actually neoliberal oligarchies, tend to rely on duplicity, what leads to cynicism and nihilism. In fact, modern oligarchies have come down with one very simple political idea, which is that it is easier to lead the masses through manipulation than through authority. In fact, you can easily rebel against authority, whereas manipulation is way harder to identify. And even if some citizens do actually identify manipulative techniques, they might have the hardest time to explain to their fellow citizens that they are in fact being manipulated. That's because modern oligarchies are constantly developing new tools to better manipulate and control their people. Those range from propagandist education to neuropolitics and the so-called civilization of spectacle, which dimensions have increased with the rise of social media and that rely on histrionic and manipulative political leaders. Manipulation and propaganda lead to duplicity, and duplicity leads to cynicism and nihilism. In fact, people may not always understand how they're being manipulated, but they end up realizing that their living standard is collapsing, that their freedoms are being restricted, etc. And so they come down to the conclusion that whatever is happening, the system isn't working in their best interest, which obviously leads to cynicism and nihilism, disengagements from political activities. According to Hannah Arendt, nihilism and cynicism were at the root of the rise of the Nazi totalitarianism in the 20th century. A very worrying statement, and we should be aware of it. So where does duplicity come from? Where did the duplicity on which our current political regimes rely come from? I consider that it comes from a long process of moral degradation. That's the idea of Leo Strauss, and he stated that there were different waves of modernities that led to this progressive degradation of our moral values. So that we went from transcendent values of personal virtue and justice to profit as a cardinal values to no values at all. According to Leo Strauss, the first wave of modernity was initiated by Machiavelli. He stated that aiming at transcendent value was way too high a goal, and that we should focus on more down-to-earth values and goals. So he said that the main goal of political action shouldn't be to aim at higher personal virtues and justice, but rather at the glory of the prince. Then came Hobbes, who substituted power to glory as the main goal of political action. Then came Locke, who said that the main goal of political action should be trade and finance, a form of Machiavellian economism, we could say. Then came Rousseau, who implemented the triumph of opinion as the ultimate criteria of justice and political action. As Leo Strauss puts it, if what the majority decides is good, if the ultimate criteria of justice relies on the idea of the majority, then cannibalism could be a good thing, as long as the majority agrees that it is. So it's a very problematic outcome. And it ends up in Nietzsche and his nihilism and very high level of destructivity, which we can see, for example, in this quote from the Antichrist, chapter 2, in which he states, "What is evil? Whatever springs from weakness. The weak, and the botched shall perish. First principle of our charity, and one should help them to it." So what we notice here is in fact a complete inversion of values from what antiquity and Judeo-Christian traditions would command, with higher values of personal virtue and justice, and going down to Nietzsche and complete nihilism, destructivity, and a call to destroying the weak instead of protecting them. That reflects a collapse of the Western worldview, which relied on those ancient antiquity and Judeo-Christian values. This collapse of our worldview is accompanied by a deadly culture among Western elites. In fact, Hannah Arendt, in The Origins of Totalitarianism, stated that the success of totalitarian movements in the 20th century had often been blamed upon the morbidity or nihilism of the modern intelligentsia, upon a supposedly typical intellectual self-hatred, upon the spirit's hostility to life and antagonism to vitality. The elite, she adds, went to war with an exultant hope that everything they knew, the whole culture and texture of life, might go down in its storm of steel. In the carefully chosen words of Thomas Mann, war was chastisement and purification. War in itself, rather than victories, inspired the poets. Destruction without mitigation, chaos and ruin as such, assumed the dignity of supreme values. What this means is that we went from times when thinkers such as Plato, Cicero, or Aquinas would emphasize the highest ethical virtues of justice as the goal of political action, to a contemporary period in which the superior values of the ruling elite are destruction, chaos, and ruin. A terrible observation indeed, and that raises serious questions of legitimacy. And that obviously has devastating consequences on all of us, on all the people, independently of their identities, such as terrible wars everywhere around the world, social distress and the opioid crisis, environmental degradations, etc., and the potential rise of new forms of totalitarianism that will affect us all of us. As a consequence of the collapse of our worldview and this process of moral degradation, we came to stick to materialistic values and to turn science into an idol that will magically cure the evils of existence and transform the human nature of man. What's more, since the world was increasingly led by opinion, it seemed like human societies were racing through history on a path on which nobody had control, what creating some sort of political fatalism. Hence, historicism was born from the idea that we could discover the laws of history and prophesy the future. As Karl Popper put it, the central mistake of historicism is that its laws turn out to be absolute trends. Trends which, like laws, do not depend on initial conditions and which carry us irresistibly in a certain direction into the future. They are the basis of unconditional prophecies as opposed to conditional scientific predictions. Yet, he adds, the evolution of life on Earth or a human society is a unique historical process, and its description is not a law, but only a singular historical statement. Anyways, many modern philosophies rely on historicism from Hegel to Karl Marx. And its application in the political realm has actually led to the creation of totalitarianism as a new kind of political regime. Totalitarian movements pretend to know the laws of history and hence be able to predict the future states of societies. Their goal is to liberate the laws of history so as to facilitate the dawn of the utopian society that they prophesy. For this reason, the one thing that totalitarian regimes and ideologies hate is human spontaneity, as it might get on the way of the free unfolding of the laws of history. Hence, totalitarianism uses any means, and terror in particular, a very primitive feeling of human beings, to annihilate human freedom altogether. Totalitarianism promotes barbarity to annihilate human spontaneity and freedom as a necessary way to liberate those laws of history that will lead to its prophetic world. And the deaths along its path are just the unavoidable waste of this process, a form of social Darwinism. Consequently, when historicism becomes the basis on which public policies are crafted, those no longer aim at the well-being of the people and at the common good, but rather at reaching a utopian future at any cost. That's a huge reversal of logic that reflects our reversal of moral values, unfortunately. People are expected to adapt to the political process rather than the opposite, and those who do not adapt are deemed weak, deranged, or neurotic, suitable for medical or psychological treatment, and their potential death is basically labeled as an unavoidable waste on the path to the utopian future. As Karl Popper puts it, those who do not like living in this type of societies only admit thereby that they're not yet fit to live in it, that their human impulses need further organizing. Yet, adds Leo Strauss, those valued judgments part themselves from those used by major historians, not by their higher level of clarity or certainty, but rather by their poverty. A good technician can be just as adapted. He can even be better adapted than a good man or a good citizen. Hence, the application of historicism to political processes leads to a resurgence of social and state barbarity that induces intense violence and malaise in human beings, rather than promoting their well-being and their general moral improvement. In this sense, it is possible to state that neoliberalism is a form of historicism. In fact, it relies on a scientific prophecy supported by the only truly scientific social science, namely neoclassical economics. It predicts that the free unfolding of the market laws and mechanisms will lead to an ideal world of richness and freedom for us all. For this reason, we need to completely unleash market laws at the global level by suspending all barriers to trade and movement. Those temporarily losing in this process, victims of poverty, social or environmental degradations, etc., are the unavoidable waste on the way of the laws of history and the idyllic future to which they're headed. Obviously, because this utopian future, a perfectly free global market, will never fully happen, that will give the global oligarchy, the only group that is actually winning from this whole process, an eternal excuse to justify oppression and destructions. If we do not pay attention, this process, which totalitarian tendencies are becoming increasingly visible, might lead to the worst forms of totalitarianism ever witnessed, thanks to novel scientific and technological tools, biotechnologies, toxicology, artificial intelligence, and those will affect us all except the global oligarchy, all of us, independently of our identities. That's what we need to understand. That could come to threaten the very nature of what it means to be human or a living creature on this planet. Now, because I don't want to appear to be too pessimistic, I want to come down with some preliminary ideas on how we could rebuild trust by constructing together an ecological civilization for tomorrow in favor of all human and living beings on this planet, independently of their kinds or their identities. So first of all, in order to do so, I obviously suggest that we rebuild our worldview and our sense of agency, that we get out of this feeling of fatalism that historicism has created. To this end, I consider that it is important that we shift from a concept of social responsibility as promoted by humanism, which was great, but was only focused on human beings, to a wider concept of what Mircea Eliade called a cosmic responsibility. That is a responsibility that will include not only all human beings, but also all living beings on this planet, because we're all equally threatened by the new scientific and technological tools and how they could be used by potential new totalitarian regimes. Secondly, I would suggest that we rethink our political regime to get out of neoliberal oligarchy, because it is bad for us all, or for a great majority of humankind, and for the environment as well. So rethinking our political regime, I am thinking that we might want to create very strong democracies at the local level where all citizens really have a stake in political decisions, can participate and give their opinion. While at a national level, we should ensure to have real meritocratic systems that choose people not on the basis of their fortune, but rather on the basis of their political skills, and most importantly, on their ethical values and interest in building a common good for all of us, all human and living beings. Then I would suggest that we obviously review the selection of our leaders, as I just said. We can't go on and select political leaders either on their fortune or on their histrionic and manipulative capacities. We need to choose people who are not only the best skilled to conduct good political processes, but also who have the ethics to think in favor of all human beings and all living beings, so as to protect our lives and our environment and make a better planet for us all. That's the goal of building an ecological civilization. Finally, in order to avoid falling into the pitfalls of historicism and totalitarian movements, we should adopt an adaptive piecemeal approach, as Karl Popper called it, to political processes. That is an approach to political processes that relies on incremental processes, that is open to learning, to making mistakes, to receiving criticism, to debates, etc., so that we do not focus on a goal and at reaching it at any cost, but rather focus the political process on human beings and other living beings and ensure that it is adapted to their needs and improves their well-being, rather than trying to reach a utopian state at some point in the future, which will probably never happen, and creating so much damage on the path to this supposed utopian future. Those are initial proposals, and they are obviously open for debates, but I hope they can be helpful and we can start building this ecological civilization that we need starting from them. Now, because we have noticed that our worldview has collapsed, our scale of values has collapsed, we are obviously at the end of something at this point, and we need to build something new. That's the whole idea of the ecological civilization I was previously mentioning. However, there remains also the truth that every end in history necessarily contains a new beginning. This beginning is the promise the only message which end can ever produce. Beginning, before it becomes a historical event, is the supreme capacity of man politically. It is identical to man's freedom. That a beginning be made, man was created, said Augustine. This beginning is guaranteed by each new birth. It is indeed every man. Those are the last words of Hannah Arendt in The Origins of Totalitarianism. It is a call to reconstruct our worldview on creative and constructive values based on life rather than chaos, destruction, and death. It is also a call to valuing each new birth and each new life, and to being responsible to future generations, including through the transmission of renewed moral and cultural values, relying on strong educational models as safeguards against deadly, degrading, and humanizing propaganda and manipulation that will affect us all. Thank you so much, and have a nice day.